So, thank you. Okay, so our speakers this evening, we are really honored to have two standout legislators with us. Lauren Carson, Representative Lauren Carson from District 75, and Senator Don Oyer, Senatorial District 13, I believe. And just by way of introduction, Lauren has been an Aquidneck Island resident since 1986, and she's serving her fourth term as state representative for Newport. And she has served on the Rhode Island Oversight, the House Internet and Broadband and Environment, and the House Small Business Committees. And she's chaired a House Study Commission on Tourism and a Rhode Island House Study Commission on the Economic Impact of Flooding and Sea Rise. Her priority issues include climate and environment, government transparency, and civic participation. She has worked in both public and nonprofit community throughout her career. She's currently employed with the Eastern Rhode Island Conservation District, where she serves as a founding member of the Rhode Island Green Infrastructure Coalition. And she also has been employed by the Clean Water Action. That was from 1985 to 1992. And that is among her many fields of interest and accomplishment. I know her best as a former colleague on the Newport Energy and Environment Commission, which we both served on for several years. And she was instrumental. She was actually the driving force behind getting an ordinance passed to require recycling from events in Newport. Don Oyer from Senate District 13 has served in the Senate since 2017 after winning a contentious special election. In the 2021-22 term, Don was the chair of the Senate Environment and Agriculture Committee and the prime Senate sponsor of the Act on Climate legislation, which set mandatory and enforceable climate targets in Rhode Island. And I would like to mention that Lauren was the prime sponsor of that bill in the House. And in honor of those two legislators, Governor McKee signed that bill on Bowen's Wharf in Newport. She sponsored the offshore wind procurement bill, directing Rhode Island Energy to purchase up to 1,000 megawatts of electricity from offshore wind. And she was recognized in 2021 as the USA Today's Rhode Island Women of the Year, and also by the Rhode Island Lawyers Weekly as one of the 2021 Lawyers of the Year. She recently completed a certificate program in energy policy at the University of Idaho, and she holds a law degree from School of Law and a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Minnesota. So I welcome these two outstanding legislators. There's way more that could be said about their records, but I'd like to give them a chance to speak for themselves. Okay, and we had not really had a chance to discuss who was going to go first. So if the two of you want to do rock, paper, scissors or something like that.
Lauren can go first. I'm good.
Yeah, and I was also thinking that I would call upon Dawn for a few things that I'll mention that she'll know a lot of. So we'll do this a little bit like a team tag thing.
We've done that before.
Yeah. So how about if we just give you 40 minutes between you and you can divvy up as you choose? Yeah, we'll bounce back and forth because the things that I'll touch on, Dawn has some things to say, I'm sure on. So what I did was, I want to thank you for having us, number one. It's really, I really enjoy being with folks like you, colleagues with whom Dawn and I share our social and political values. So I want to thank you very much for having us. And as Beth said, Dawn and I served with Beth for years on the Newport Energy Environment Commission, which was really what helped to launch Dawn and I into really more public policy work, which led us to become representatives for the great city of Newport. What I did was I looked at the questions that Beth sent along and tried to answer them to the best of my ability. So what I'm going to do is take them one at a time. So the first question was, how do you see the status of environmental legislation after last year's session and the potential for the effectiveness of measures passed? I wanted to just take a quick minute to go over the things that we did pass last year. And that's where I think Dawn can kind of catch on to a few things. We voted to substantially increase renewable energy production and supply to 100% of Rhode Island's electricity, offset by renewables production in 11 years, which was really a very big achievement. I think we're probably the leader in the region for setting 100% renewables for the state. If not the country, Dawn. I don't know if you're aware of that. I know that we're pretty much ahead of the pack. I don't know if we're the number one in the country.
Yeah, no, we're a leader in the country as well, and I think the setting those renewable energy goals really sends a signal to the marketplace as well. So it's we're in a very good place in competition with our colleagues in state government and neighboring states, and I always tell them that this is a race that we all want to win. So, but yeah, we are a leader in the region and across the country on that.
Yes, and also, as Beth said, Rhode Island will open the door to significantly more renewable energy for the state under legislation seeking the development of 600 to 1,000 megawatts of offshore wind capacity, and that was Dawn's bill. Do you want to speak to that, Dawn, at all?
Yeah, sure. So I also just want to say a quick thanks to that. It's so I always love, I know I've spoken with this group before and got many good friends on the call that I haven't seen in a very long time. So it's good to see so many of you. Yeah, so the offshore wind legislation, I think that, as Lauren mentioned, it's up to 1,000 megawatts of offshore wind legislation. And what we really tried to do with that bill is not just hit our clean energy goals, which are incredibly important, but we also wanted to make sure that we are doing this development in a responsible way. So the way that we had the public utility issue this, basically what we're doing is we're directing the utility to purchase clean energy, and we're specifying that it must be offshore wind. And if you look at the cost benefits of this, we're in a regional energy grid. And when you have new suppliers come on, so many people have heard about, gas constraints in the region, things like that. The great thing about offshore wind is that offshore wind operates best in the wintertime. And that's when we would see any gas constraints. So the reality is, we are over reliant on natural gas, and having offshore wind, the wind blows harder in the winter in New England. So we could offset our winter peak issues if we get offshore wind online sooner. And it also is going to send a cost signal to the market because of how our power purchasing works in the region. Offshore wind, the most recent price per kilowatt hour I saw was about 7 or 8 cents per kilowatt hour, whereas gas is clearing the market at 18 cents per kilowatt hour. So it'll be a huge saving, and what it does is it will drive the entire supply market down, and that affects all of our electric rates. So
super. So to move on, the General Assembly approved Plastic Waste Reduction Act, which is designed to reduce the use of plastic checkout bags by retail establishments and setting a statewide policy. Because prior to this, about 18 or 19 municipalities had banned plastic bags. Now we have a statewide system. So when we look at, legislative priorities for the next session or the next year or two, plastics reduction is a priority, and it's been a very difficult issue to deal with. I sit on the Environment Committee, Dawn chairs the Environment Committee. We've heard lots of bills around banning bottles, banning nips, creating producer responsibility bills. There's a lot of frustration in the environmental community and for some of the more progressive environmental legislators that we really can't come to any compromise with the industry as to how to exactly deal with plastic. So I do think that plastics legislation will be heard again next year, and it might be something you want to look at and pay attention to, because I think we all are aware that reducing plastic in the environment is really a critical issue. I mean, that's where the oil companies are directing their money, since we're using more renewable energy. They're putting it into increased plastic production. And when we look at plastic pollution around the world, I'm sure we've all seen the photographs and how awful the plastic pollution is. So I do think that'll be an issue for next year. I don't know if you want to add to that, Dawn, but.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I know Lauren and I have worked on that bag ban when it was in front of Newport. And so being able to work with her and others on bringing it statewide was very satisfying. Sad that it took us as long as it did, but we're there now. But no, Lauren is totally right. We need to, stem it at the source. And so figuring out the producer responsibility bills. And I also think additionally, some form of bottle bill, which has been, stymied in Rhode Island forever. But there's new models on bottle bills across the country. And, the fact that we're 20 years behind on the bottle bill conversation means that we can learn from what's been happening in other states. So I'm going to take the silver lining on that one and say that hopefully, I know that both chambers had really great testimony last year around the bottle bill, and my cat has decided to join the meeting. So I apologize for that.
Yeah. So in terms of next year's legislative session, I would suggest being on the lookout for any bill related to plastic reduction, and bottle bills would be one of them. That would definitely be something to look at. We also passed legislation to prohibit the very hazardous substance called PFAS from food packaging made or sold in Rhode Island. And we provided for the Department of Health to establish maximum contaminant levels for PFAS in drinking water. PFAS has increasingly over the past 5 years become a toxic product, chemical in the environment, and it's increasingly, we're knowing more and more about it as time goes by. The EPA has made more of a priority about it. There's even some money in the infrastructure bill that passed a year ago to begin dealing with PFAS. So I don't think that the fight is over on PFAS. I think that we've limited the amount that's in takeout products, but there's also PFAS in firefighter foam and firefighters uniforms, which I think we're dealing with. The firefighters' uniforms, I think there was some money in the budget for that. And there's also PFAS in some drinking water around the state. So that fight is not over on that particular chemical in the environment. I pay close attention to that. We passed a bond, the 50 million green bond, and put it on the ballot. So that passed. The voters in Rhode Island are very sensitive to green bonds. We pass them all the time. And so that money will go for a variety of things: conservation, recreation, Roger Williams Park Zoo. That money will be spilling out over the next 12 to 24 months around the state. And if you're interested in knowing more about that and getting your municipality involved, because there will be grants for municipalities, that's something that you can dig in and look at a little bit more closely. We've allocated $25 million from the American Rescue Plan Act for grants to help low and moderate income households purchase heat pumps. We also voted to rein in neonics, which is a specific type of pesticide, a neuroactive insecticide that's come under increasing security also. So those are sort of some of the highlights that I have. And before I turn it back to Dawn on that, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that I've worked on and what I think I'm going to be working on next year. Dawn and I have talked about, to stay on the topic of pesticides, Dawn and I have talked about doing something on pesticides, which is an issue that I have been concerned about for about 40 years. I have a background in environmental policy, and as a young woman working in New Jersey, we passed one of the nation's first and strict right to know laws about chemicals, and we worked to pass a pesticide right to know bill. That way, people dealing with these pesticides would know about them and how hazardous they are. So it's something that has stayed with me for quite a long time, exposure to pesticides. Dawn and I looked at a bill where we would require retail stores that distribute pesticides to put a sign up to at least inform consumers that they're buying hazardous materials. We've never really pushed that aggressively, but I was doing some more reading. There's been a lot of work done in California on limiting the use of Roundup. There was a huge lawsuit out there and the plaintiff won, and Roundup is on the defensive now aggressively because they've really linked it to specific types of cancer. And I was reading just today in some of my own research about states and municipalities, including Connecticut, that have banned the use of a Roundup on school property and municipal parks, which I actually thought was kind of an interesting tack. So, you know, as of this morning, I thought I may take a closer look at that because there were about 15 states and municipalities around the country, large municipalities, that have banned the use of that product where children are playing. And I thought, that's something interesting I might want to look at. There was another bill that I introduced last session that I introduced it just for conversational purposes. Sometimes we introduce bills that are really easy and they're going to slip through real simply, something from a municipality or a resolution. Sometimes we pass bills that are going to take 3 and 5 years to pass, and they're going to be big conversation pieces. Sometimes we introduce bills so that we could just bring it to the attention of our colleagues, which is what I did with this next bill. I had read that in the paving of Route 6, all that realignment of Route 6, toxic materials had been used in the paving materials. And the unions had discovered that about a year or two ago. The Attorney General was looking into that. And so I thought that that was pretty horrendous, that toxic materials were being used, and the unions were able to collaborate that was what was going on. They actually followed the trucks into Massachusetts where the contractor was working, and they saw what they were bringing back. And I read about 6 weeks ago that a lawsuit was settled with the contractor because it was proven that they were using these materials, and they're obligated to pay about $500,000 in fines and $1 million to the state of Rhode Island for using those materials. So I'm going to put that bill in again, which would ban the use of toxic materials in paving streets, which I think makes perfectly simple sense. I sat on a Coastal Resource Management Council study commission under the leadership of Representative Ruggiero, who is stepping down this year because of her run for lieutenant governor. And there were some unsettled issues around the way the recommendations we made around the Coastal Resource Management Council, particularly the design of the council and how they are appointed. And for folks that are in coastal communities, particularly Jamestown, Block Island, a few other communities where the public has been unhappy with their decisions, there is some momentum to continue to take a closer look at that council. So I'll probably be picking up 1 or 2 of the bills that came out of that study commission. I also looked at stormwater runoff in parks, and I required the Department of Environmental Management to study 4 of our state parks that sit on the bay. So we begin evaluating the runoff from the bay, which spills right over to the discussion of sea rise and act on climate, because we have several state parks that sit right on the coast. And as the sea rises and as the runoff comes down, capture either pesticides on state park land or animal waste on state park land, we do have to begin considering how we're going to handle that water. We're talking about Fort Adams, we're talking about the park in Bristol, and we're talking about Lincoln up in Lincoln. Those are the 3 parks that they're supposedly studying. Dawn and I did successfully pass the Act on Climate in 2021, which often amazes me that we did it, and I'm frequently amazed at how grateful Rhode Islanders are that we did this, and we did it because it was the right thing to do. That's how Dawn's in my commitment to environmental issues. I've had people walk up to me saying, "You passed Act on Climate," strangers, but the work is not over with the Act on Climate. We've done a lot of work on energy in Rhode Island, and I'm going to leave that to Dawn to talk about, by the setting our standards for renewable energy, for work we're going to do offshore, and a couple of other energy issues that I know Dawn is more knowledgeable than I am. But there were specific things in the Act on Climate that we need to take a closer look to make sure that they're happening. And I'm working now to try to figure out exactly, I always go back to the text of the law when I talk about the Act on Climate. First of all, we are obligated to engage the environmental justice community in implementation of the Act on Climate. And I was able to get a member of the environmental justice community on the Environment Council EC4 Advisory Committee, which means that we have at least one person of color on the advisory committee that's discussing the implementation of Act on Climate, which I should tell you got a tremendous amount of feedback in the chamber. It was amazing you know, we have this advisory committee that's looking at the Act on Climate, and all I wanted to do was get one person from an EJ community on that, and it was just an amazing debate on the floor. It was completely unexpected, which really makes a few statements about the understanding of environmental justice communities and their vulnerability to environmental issues, which I would suggest you continue to pay close attention to. But there's other parts of the act that I've been concerned about. I mean, we're obligated to engage the private sector. We're obligated to engage municipalities. And I've had a few, I'm beginning conversations with people as recently as yesterday about, you know, what does that mean? Like, for example, I would say that 80% of the people in the state of Rhode Island have no idea what the Act on Climate is. You know, they just never heard of it. And this is like a huge monumental achievement in the state that's going to really reverse our contribution to climate change. And I have wanted to, and will still be working, toying with the idea of some kind of an engagement process with municipalities and some of our largest employers to really begin bringing them up to speed on what their obligations are, what our obligations are as a state of Rhode Island to meet the climate goals that were set forth in the Act on Climate. The other thing that I was interested in the Act on Climate was the creation of the dashboard. We're obligated to create a dashboard that will be accessible to the public so that they can go on and see how we're meeting our energy goals. And just yesterday, I was in a conversation with some people about the dashboard. I know that the Department of Environmental Management is looking at the dashboard, but I'd like to see us make sure we give them enough money to really do a good job on creating this dashboard. And not only would I like to see energy related information there, but I'd like to see stormwater and sea rise information there as well. Because oftentimes when we discuss climate in the chambers, many of the bills have been related to energy and reduction of emissions, which is critical to the implementation and the success of the bill. But we have other things we need to be worried about, like melting glaciers at a rapid speed and flooding in critical neighborhoods in Newport, in Warren, in Warwick, in Cranston, in Barrington, that are jeopardizing properties and jeopardizing institutional assets along the coast. So I'm going to continue to work on ways to see how we can put some money into some of those things, which will also contribute to the implementation of the act. I think there were other questions you wanted me to address. I don't know if you want to go now. I have other non-environmental issues. Maybe you want to stay on environment, Dawn, and then I'll go back to the, because they also asked us what our other priorities are. So I was going to mention some non-enviro stuff. Maybe you want to go on environment now, and then I can come back to that stuff.
Sure. Yeah. So, you know, I think Lauren did a great job covering a lot of the work we've already done. I kind of already mentioned some of the legislation that I've passed in the last couple of years. I want to pick up the thread where Lauren started about environmental justice. So I have a long history of working for on environmental justice issues. Actually, when I was in my first year of law school, one of my projects that I did as a first year law student was I worked with an attorney out of Rhode Island Legal Services as they were suing a whole bunch of people, including the state and I believe the city of Providence, over the siting of the Alvarez School. And so I don't know, I think Beth is familiar with that case, but I don't know if anyone else is, but basically they did a school siting on a toxic site. So there was a trend probably about 15 years ago of needing to buy land for schools, and guess what's cheap land? Toxic land. And so there was this effort of trying to remediate these toxic properties and put schools on top of it. Well, what also doesn't work well with toxic chemicals is developing baby brains. And by the way, remediation of toxic sites is very often not possible to be done to a level with which you would want children and workers to be on those properties for the amount of time that kids are in school. So there was a movement, a pushback on the environmental justice community to push back against that trend. And I was fortunate enough to be able to work on the lawsuit in my early legal career and then was also helped pass, I think that passed back in like 2013 or 2014, maybe even 2012, the legislation that bars Rhode Island from putting schools on toxic brownfield sites. So I think that's a really good thing, but that's also the last focused environmental justice bill, in my opinion, that the state has passed. I think Lauren talked about the stuff we did in Act on Climate. We very intentionally made sure that environmental justice was mentioned in that. When I became chair of the committee, I asked, one of the first things I did was ask the policy staff, can you tell me how many times in state law environmental justice is mentioned? 0. It was in some Department of Environmental Management policies, but it wasn't actually in statute. So when we did Act on Climate, that was very important to me to have it included as part of that conversation. And I know that, so one of the other, and so as a result of that, I introduced the Environmental Justice Act. And what the Environmental Justice Act does is it looks at, it's modeled off of a bill coming out of New Jersey, and it basically allows the Department of Environmental Management to look at cumulative negative polluting impacts on human health based on siting. So a good example, everybody's like first thought when they think of environmental justice is the port. Well, part of the problem at Provport is that you're able to do, all right, we've got this 11-acre parcel, and we're going to give them an air permit based on, they're an asphalt plant and maybe they have 11 acres, but then you're going to put, a concrete crushing facility right next to it. That's got air emissions. That's a 15-acre facility. Now you've got the LNG terminals. That's 25 acres. They're all right next to each other. But the way that the permits are done right now under law, those properties are seen as individual properties and individual permits. So what the Environmental Justice Act would do is it would look at all of those permits and the cumulative impacts that it has on those neighborhoods, because we know that pollution does not respect those acre parcel boundaries. So yes, exactly, Clara. I know Clara's adding stuff in the chat. So but Provport is not the only example of that. This is very, very often happens in low income communities and communities of color, which are seen as dumping grounds for industry. And so a way to address this more equitably is actually to give the Department of Environmental Management the ability to deny permits or adjust permits based on those factors. And so that having that cumulative impact metric is incredibly important to get that into state law from an equity perspective. And also there's an element in the bill that allows for citizen voices to be part of that decision-making process. Because I think, there's some communities that just have more political power than others. And so being able to have in environmental justice areas, the ability for neighborhoods to actually be considered and actually be consulted when these, things are looking at moving into neighborhoods is a hugely important part of that. So I plan on introducing that again. Representative Karen Alzate is my co-sponsor on that legislation in the House. We just had a seminar yesterday. There's the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators is a state coordinates state legislators on environmental issues, and they just had a session yesterday on environmental justice where they had the folks from New Jersey talk about their bill and how they got it done. So I know some folks attended that and are fired up to work on that. And then similarly, along the same lines, lead pipe replacement. So one of the things I know Lauren was talking about, all of the money that's out there for the different infrastructure projects, and lead pipe replacement is huge. Most folks don't realize this, but Newport is one of the communities that has the highest percentage of lead pipes. And part of it is because of our age, but obviously, Newport, Providence, and what ends up happening and what we want to, so what ends up happening is that, municipalities will do the street side replacement, but then the service line replacement, the part that's on the private property is up to the property owner. The city of Providence has done a great job. They've actually had a program that they've been working with the infrastructure bank on having a 0 interest loan offering to property owners. But what ends up happening is that property owners who don't live on the property will literally tell the city of Providence, no, we don't want to replace that. Because if they don't live in the property, they don't want to take out the loan. Or they just don't want to have the work done on the property because they don't have to. And anyone who's done construction knows that there's many things that could happen. So they don't want to open the door to the unknowns. So the lead pipe legislation, we passed it in the Senate last year. I'm planning on introducing it this year. I was the second sponsor on it. It was Leader McCaffrey's bill last year, but I'm going to be taking it for next year. And one of the things I want to add onto it, because originally in the legislation we had it that that they would have to change the service lines at point of sale. But we know that many properties aren't going to be sold, and so I want to set a date, maybe 6 years out, that we can just say by 6 years out, all these lines need to be replaced, because folks shouldn't be able to say like, no, I don't want to to replace this, especially when there's just a flood of federal dollars. So what has been a loan program in Providence would basically be a grant program. So we would run it through the infrastructure bank again. But it would be a grant program. But as with anything private property, you need to get the private property owner's permission. They can't just go and dig it up. So we're hoping with a carrot and stick approach, we're going to set a date certain by which they need to make the replacement, and we're going to provide money to do so with leveraging the federal funds that are out there with the infrastructure dollars. But that's definitely something for folks to pay attention to, and we will need help to get that across the finish line in the strongest possible way.
Yeah, I'll comment on that. The city of Newport, for those folks that are from Newport on this call, is really interested in that. I've spoken to at least 1 or 2 city councilors about this, and I'm going to try to make sure we activate the Newport City Council on this bill, Dawn, because I know they've asked in passing conversations, they've asked me about, what did I know about the infrastructure money? Because, we don't have the time here to go into the infrastructure money, but there was a ton of money that came in the infrastructure bill from last year, and then there's the Inflation Reduction Act, which was just passed in the spring, which has billions of dollars for climate. And that could be a subject of a whole nother presentation, because there's lots of money there. And some of the things that we're talking about, the lead pipes, particularly, and some of the stormwater stuff and some of the PFAS stuff, there's money in all of that. We just have to get our communities to apply for the money. So that's good news, actually, that this money's coming.
Yeah, and I think having the federal rules on the lead pipe thing, they did a good job on having an equity focus, but I think we can do more on a state level to really make sure that the program works for us. And then the last thing I'll mention, because I know we're close to time and we want to have time for Q&A, and there's plenty more to discuss. But the last thing I'll mention is what one of the things that Lauren kind of hinted at is that energy transition piece. So implementation of Act on Climate is huge across all of the sectors. So we've got the buildings, we've got the electricity sector, and we've got the transportation sector. So figuring out, when folks talk about climate transition work, they primarily think of those kind of 3 sectors. And so figuring out transitions in each of those is critically important. And so, as Lauren mentioned, I've been very active on the energy transition piece of it. And I think what I've come to kind of find out is that, I think Act on Climate is doing a great job at, requiring agencies to actually think about and incorporate Act on Climate into the work that they're doing. But in order to really kind of get to the speed and scale of the transition that we need, I think that we're going to need to do some adjustments for the utility. I think we need to do utility reform. And part of that is going to require like adjusting business models. And there's a lot to that, and it gets like in depth and wonky really fast. But I think like my description of it is going to be utility reform. We have a new utility. We're in a unique position in Rhode Island where we have the same utility who owns the gas infrastructure and the electrical distribution network is owned by the same company. There's a real opportunity there to do more with what we have for less than other states who have multiple competing interests, who aren't all all going to have, you know, the same financial interest. I think we can do things to adjust it, take advantage of our small size, the fact that we have a single utility, and you know, try to up the speed and scale of the transition that we need. So I know that Beth, you put a question in the chat about the community electricity aggregation. I'm happy to touch on that. But Lauren, I'll throw it back to you if you wanted to talk about anything else before we start doing Q&A.
Yeah, so how much more time do we have here, Beth? I think
Beth, you're muted. You're muted, Beth.
That was very good. Yes, I figured till about 10 off, and then we would turn it over to question and answers.
Sure. Okay. So, the only thing I want to do is I want to say some things that I'm working on that are non-environment, just to touch on them. The first thing that I've been working on for several years is the creation of an ombudsman for special education, which would be an independent office mimicked after the Child Advocate's Office, which is a highly successful independent office in the state of Rhode Island. That would be a resource to parents of special needs children to ensure that their IEPs are being met and they're getting the services they deserve. That bill did pass the Senate last year and did not pass the House, but I'm feeling really confident. I'm hoping to get at least 30 sponsors on this bill this year, so I'm focusing on that. The second thing that I'm focusing on is the creation of a department on aging. We had a department on aging in the state of Rhode Island created in 1977, which became a division on aging, which became an office on aging. So by the mere titles that the changes are, there's a suggestion that they're smaller in scope and scale. And the services were distributed across different organizations and different administrative bodies in the state of Rhode Island. And when you look at the folks who are over 50, over 65, we all know that demographic is growing dramatically. In fact, in our community, Newport, we have the highest percentage of seniors relative to the total population of the city. And in fact, the AARP did a study that showed that in the primary this year, 72% of the voters were over 50. So this is a significant demographic. And I put a bill in the spring to do this, and it didn't pass. It was one of those bills I didn't expect to pass, but it got a lot of traction and it got a lot of attention. So I'm going to really focus on really figuring out how to consolidate services for senior citizens. Those are two of my non-environmental top priorities. I do have other bills, but I'm going to stop there and leave it to Dawn to finish if you want to, Dawn.
Yeah, I'll just quickly mention one non-environmental or energy related bill, which is the house. So we currently have the housing foreclosure mediation program that sets a bunch of parameters in place that if people fall behind on their mortgage before foreclosure can happen, there's certain notices, requirement for mediation. That bill or that legislation actually sunsets this year. So I'm working with Rhode Island Housing and the housing advocates to make sure that we can renew that protection. We're at a point in time where we're feeling, there's some parts of our economy that are flush with cash, and then there's some people who are really struggling. So all of those housing assistance programs, all of those dollars have been weaned off. And so I think figuring out how we make sure that we don't end up having like a bunch of we need to not only end homelessness, but we need to not make it worse in the meantime. And so, extending those foreclosure protections are incredibly important. And then the other one, which is also housing related, is that one of the things that was super beneficial with that series of federal funding was having basically an emergency fund, the rental assistance fund, that would protect people from being evicted. Because if they were getting evicted for non-payment of rent, they would go into court. Basically, the Center for Justice or the other legal advocates would step in and they would say, okay, you're eligible for this rental assistance fund. They would, end the eviction, pay off the rent, end the eviction, and the person would stay housed, the family would stay housed. So we don't have anything like that in state. We don't have state funding. We don't have a rental assistance fund that exists, except for through primarily charities. So I'm trying to figure out if there's a way for us to start one of those funds, because I've talked to none of the judges want to evict somebody and want people to end up on the street. And, to be able to have had that resource was just such a blessing for everybody as that was available. So I really do think we need to figure out how to make that, make that benefit available for folks who are facing that challenge. So.
Yeah, and I wanted to address the question that George put in the chat. I can't stand those loud things. I'm like so on your team. I live on a street with 4 houses, and somebody's cutting their lawn every day. I was actually thinking of asking them, can we pick one day that we all cut our lawn? That way, one day there's noise and 6 days there's not noise, because it drives me nuts. We did have a bill to do that last year. It was heard in the Environment Committee, and the landscaping industry just went off the charts. They just said, oh, we're going to put them out of business. That's the response. It's like, we want to do this, you're putting us out of business. We want to ban, this or that, you're putting us out of business. That's like the go-to answer. So the sponsor was Representative Speakman out of Warren and Bristol, and she's a terrific legislator and a colleague of mine. And she sits in environment also, and we heard the bill, and we really got a lot of pushback from the landscaping industry. And so I don't know what she's going to do this year, but whatever it is, I would be a co-sponsor of it, because I can't stand the noise. I'm with you on that.
I mean, Senator Sam Zuri of Providence had it in the Senate. And I will tell you, I've been called a lot of names since I have been elected to office, and the amount of people, the names that I was called because I signed on to that bill was really astounding. It was really, really astounding. So Lauren is not kidding when she's saying that we got pushback on that bill. I mean, that bill like blew up my inbox. People found my number and the vulgar messages that I was left because I was a co-sponsor on that bill. So I'm glad to hear it, because I agree with you. Every time the lawn equipment comes around, I live down the street from a landscaping company, so I hear it constantly. So
I wonder if there's no children in my house or on my block, but if you had a child that lived here, I don't know how the child would even sleep. I mean, it's just really needs to be addressed. I think one of the problems is a legitimate problem that the landscapers raised is that the battery operated equipment is not, the charge is not long enough to really get them through the day. So there's some issues around supply that's maintained in these pieces of equipment. That's one concern. And, they're transitioning over. We need to probably consider some kind of a transition model. And I don't know what Representative Speakman is thinking about, but yeah, actually we were starting with leaf blowers. That was all that we were doing, George. That was the bill was just on leaf blowers. So we'll see. I don't think that's over. I think that that's going to be around, but we need to see how the issue develops over the next few years. There's a question here about hydroelectric, Dawn. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, so most of the hydroelectric facilities are dams, and they come from other places. So there's because we're part of a regional energy grid. So just to be clear, I support hydro when, just like, most of the renewable energy sources when it's done responsibly. And I think there's ways for, I actually, as part of this class I took a tour of a hydro dam in Washington State. I've never learned so much about fish. But so I do think that needs to be part of the energy conversation. But those are usually done in like rivers. And so I think the hydro that we would benefit from in the bay as part of the ocean state, the wave technology conversations or the tidal technology conversations, they're not there yet at scale that we would need yet. I think that, I think it's one of those areas that we need some more research and development. But I think just like any other, I think with any of the conversations around renewables and around energy in general, I think we need to get smarter about how we are thinking about our grid, how we're thinking about energy, and how we are thinking about the interconnectedness of it all. Because, especially as we transition to, folks having electric vehicles and, what we can do to like, lower like the peak needs, because our energy infrastructure is built to withstand peak capacity for certain periods of time. And if we can lower those peaks and smooth out the demand, we're only going to do that if we, you know, can get like smart meters. So like moving to smart meters and things like that. But yeah, so that's generally, I think the hydro stuff is good. I worry about anything that is generated, anything that's a power generation that's too far away from the demand source is going to cost us a ton of money in transmission. So, you know, what you end up making up for, you know, in saving a fuel cost, you're paying for because you're having to run lines from wherever the generator is. And then I'll answer too. Beth had a question about the community electricity aggregation program. So I know that there was an initial issue with the community aggregation, the municipal aggregation program, in trying to find suppliers. The energy markets are global, right? And so the Russia's war on Ukraine, all of that stuff just kind of like threw everything sideways out the window. And as a result, because these municipal aggregation programs are basically long-term contracts at a set price, so we were having an issue getting suppliers to actually want to commit to certain prices because the markets were going haywire. That's stabilized to some degree at this point. And so I know that a bunch of the communities that are participating have been able to find suppliers and have been able to secure those contracts. But I think you're right, there's a low uptake on it. And I think there's about 7 municipalities out of the 39 who are participating in that program. And so I think that, you know, right now what it has been, there's the effort of onboarding people to that program has been largely the consultant's job to go make the pitch to the city and town councils, who may or may not understand, you know, what the programs are. I know we had quite the conversation in Newport when they were talking about joining in. So yeah.
Hi, this is Kathy. I went through that in my town, Charlestown. We brought folks in. We used Newport as the model. We thought we were making great gains with it, but it just died because I think it's just hard for people to get their head around. But still going to try it. But I have a question.
I'm sorry. I was going to say one of the issues that came up was whether it would be an opt-in or an opt-out program. Some counselors were disturbed by the part that people would be automatically in unless they opted out, and yet there would not be enough participation if they relied on opting in. So they did go to opt out.
Well, and I mean by that, but the part of what the municipal aggregation is supposed to do is allow, you know, a kind of different level of control over your supplier. And, you know, quite frankly, like who wants to opt in to like National Grid, you know? So like the default is you're opted into National Grid. So whether it's an opt-in or an opt-out to the municipal program, like right now, everyone in Rhode Island, except for Block Island and except for Pasco, everyone else is opted into National Grid because that is our state utility. So if anyone else hears that, if anyone else has that conversation in their community, just ask them who wants to opt into National Grid. Well, Rhode Island Energy. And so.
And I have a question for the two of you on the Act on Climate. How do we, you know, we the people, stay on top of what is happening with that, and how can we help put pressure to make sure things actually get done the way they're supposed to get done?
Good question. I was on a call yesterday discussing that very thing, because in some corners there's some concern. You know, the Act on Climate has authorized the EC4 to implement the Act on Climate. They are an administrative council that was created in 2014. And they are representatives from almost all of the executive administrative departments, RIPTA and Rhode and Health and DEM and CRMC, and they have the mission. And now we do have a new director, not recently, but we have the director, Terry Gray, assumed that position when Janet Coit went to Washington about 1.5 years ago or so. And Terry chairs those meetings. They used to only meet quarterly. Now they meet monthly. Oh, that's a good thing. At least they're meeting more regularly. Right. They also move the meetings around, which is another good thing. Instead of meeting in a room at DEM where there's no windows, they now actually go out in the community. They met in Newport. They've met in Central Falls. They met in Warren. And they have they're building the dashboard, engaging the businesses, doing the EJ work. They don't have enough resources. That's pretty much the bottom line. What can citizens do? They can follow the activities of the EC4 to see that that you can find them. I think this DEM has a whole website on Act on Climate, if I'm not mistaken. So you can go find. I don't have it off the top of my head, but
I'll find it and I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, they do have some electronic information. Those meetings may be recorded, so you can catch up and see what they're doing. And I actually have not been to the last few of their meetings. I've been a little bit preoccupied. Although I didn't have an opponent in this race, it was still election season and I was pretty preoccupied with election stuff. But I do somewhat attend those meetings to find out what the sentiment is there.
Are there penalties?
I'm not really answering your question thoroughly. I mean, what do you think, Dawn? We still need more statewide apparatus to implement this thing, and I think that, with what we have now, they're working along and they're chugging along, but we need to advocate for, more statewide apparatus to actually move this along. That's why, I'm interested in seeing some money spent on the actual parts of the bill itself. Like, how are we going to let people know that they have to begin doing these things? How are we going to what are we going to give municipalities? I was in a conversation yesterday about this. And that's, I think, where the conversation has to go to some extent. I don't know. What do you think, Dawn?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that this is like a walk and chew gum situation. I mean, we're 20 years behind on the bottle bill. We're 40 years behind on dealing with climate change. So, the reality is we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. So a lot of the stuff that Lauren and I will be working on this coming session are going to be actually like, what's the next step? What's the next policy change? What's the implementation? So the energy transition stuff, I mean, that's implementing Act on Climate. It's just kind of jumping ahead of like the plan actually being done. But I do think that the work that the EC4 is doing is really important to follow and show up for and support. I think in addition to what Lauren is saying about them traveling around the state, they've been doing a hybrid approach to a lot of their meetings as well. So, you can view them and their materials are online. You can sign. So not many folks know this, but through the Secretary of State's office, there's a portal there where you can sign up to get notices for upcoming meetings. And you can do that for any agency. So any public body that you care about in the state of Rhode Island will have, it's the way that the sign up is kind of not really intuitive, but I can, if any of you want to know how to do that, reach out to me and I'll help you walk through it. But so you can get email alerts like, oh, this is when they post their next meeting. And all the public bodies in the state at the beginning of the year have to post their annual calendar. So, you can even set it aside and say, oh, they're going to meet. I mean, they'll make adjustments throughout the year. That won't be set in stone, but it'll be a kind of good estimate as to when those meetings will take place. And I think, that ends up being a thing, right? People have meeting fatigue. There's always another thing, but, the EC4 really does appreciate the comments and the feedback that folks have to give to them. And then I think, following, along at the General Assembly, well, Lauren and I and others, I know the whole climate caucus that Lauren started is really fantastic. There's a group of us in the Senate, my colleague, my vice chair, Ilana DeMario, she's a South County senator. We're all working on bills that are really going to be trying to tweak those policies at the state level that are going to allow us to hit those goals. So like the transportation sector, haven't really talked about that. That's going to be a beast to battle. There's some federal money about transitioning fleets, so with the state fleet, moving those from, diesel to electric, some of RIPTA's already been on that pathway of electrifying their fleet. And there's funding specifically for school bus fleets.
We can't get that money though. We can't get that school bus money because they're not giving it to private vendors. And so many of our schools are in some kind of a pack. What do you know about that?
Talk to Karen Bradbury. Karen Bradbury and Mike actually worked something out. I think that's been changed.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Well, someone has asked what the EC4. It's the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council. So that's why there's 4 C's, Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council. And Dawn is right. They have been having, not in the past couple of months, but they have this year put together a series of meetings, some which were in the evening to accommodate working people, some which were during the day on different topics related to the implementation. So there are ways to follow their work. If you go to their page, Dawn's put it in there, and you can get on their mailing list, and they'll tell you when the meetings are. So that, they are the people right now in charge of doing that work. So those are the people that you might want to follow more closely.
And I think the other thing that I'll say too about what you all can do, the amount, and Lauren touched on this a little while ago, I think it was about the plastics thing, but the amount of money and time and effort that gets spent on rhetoric against those of us who are trying to advance these initiatives is enormous. And so I'm never one to say, all right, get into some Twitter battle, because, you shouldn't spend your time arguing with like China bots or Russia bots. But, the reality is, like, people will put, letters to the editor in, or, things in the local paper or on your local, like, online news source, and they're just wrong, or they're taking a frame of it that just totally ignores climate, totally ignores environment, thinks that, raw cost and, like, who cares about all the externalities that is our climate is melting. So any time that you all, feel so inclined, if you're reading the paper and shaking your fist in the air, put pen to paper, and send a letter and respond. I mean, that really does matter. Local officials read, we read those on the state level, local folks read those, and that court of public opinion really does influence our work at the State House. One of the things that they do at the State House is they send around news clips. They email them to a group of folks. And so even if all the legislators don't read those, the staffers do, chief of staffs will read them. All the policy staff reads them. So, those things really do matter. And if we are silent and not pushing back or against the disinformation, that's a problem, because we're leaving a void and we're letting them win the argument. And most of the time,
but an idea is, if you have a committee such as this, what I have done with some folks is set up a schedule of letters to the editor, like, one a week on different bills, and make that assignment maybe in January, and have, like, Beth writes a letter the first week of January on plastics, George writes a letter the second week of January on leaf blowers, and you just get those letters out. And you could do that over the course of, say, 2 or every other week. You could do that. And if you set that up with the person's name and their topic and the date they have to send it out, that's a really effective way to get those letters organized. Dawn also alluded to the Aquidneck Island Climate Caucus, which is really a very loosely associated group of people here on Aquidneck Island that Representative Courtvan of Portsmouth and I created. And we have meetings every couple of months where we just bring, just like this, we talk about issues. We may talk about a specific issue. Our most popular meeting is usually in January, when we have Senator Whitehouse join us, and we're going to start planning that now. Or we might bring in different legislators to talk on different topics. If anyone wants to be on that mailing list, it's on Zoom. We do them on Zoom. If anyone wants to be on that mailing list and know about our meetings, you can, Beth, if you could share my email with people, or I can put it in the chat, and you can just let me know, I'll add you to the mailing list. We usually meet on Sunday nights for about an hour to an hour and a half. And we usually meet about every 2 months. It's not really that a big a deal. But next year we're looking at, we're concerned about pyrolysis, which we did not discuss, Dawn, at all here, which is bringing a burning system to the state of Rhode Island, which we have successfully stopped, at least in the House this year. And we're thinking about activating this group of people. We have about 250 people on our mailing list that are concerned about climate the way you are. So it's a significant body of people. So we're thinking about pyrolysis. We're thinking about bringing in the senator. We're thinking about just doing a briefing on the top bills that are being considered once the session begins to take off. So I'll add my email here. And if you want to drop me a note, you're more than welcome to join that mailing list. We won't clog your mailbox. I promise you, because I do it all. And it's usually about once every couple months.
Yeah.
I don't see any
wanted to say that here, coming down to the wire, and I wanted to give Kathy Solomon a chance to scan the questions and see if we need to cover anything that the senator and the representative haven't already hit on.
I think we did everything that's in the chat. I don't see any others. So Beth, if you want to wrap up.
Okay, well, I certainly thank you both very, very much for a very informative presentation. And I thank everybody else for your well-informed and considered questions. And to you both for taking those questions up. You've given us a lot to chew on and a lot of resources at the same time. And thank you so much. And this was a great start off to our, what we hope will be a series. And we very much appreciate your enthusiasm about taking part in this event. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, everybody else, for your attentiveness. And I guess we're in pretty good shape. So we will let you know what's coming up next and when it's coming up. And we're still working on that. And we're still working on the format. If you have any comments on the format, you have Kate McGovern's email from when she put it out there. It was Kate McGovern, there's a number after it, at Gmail. Maybe you could send your questions and suggestions about our format to her.
Yep, she's going to put it in the chat.
Okay, yeah, it'll be in the chat.
I think.
So
there it is. Yeah.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Have a great evening, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
Night, thanks. Bye-bye.